A trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there, and welcome to the show. This is a place where people who long to think freely can gather. Now, unfortunately, there are those who do not appreciate our free thinking. They refer to it as wrong think. I say we wear it like a badge of honor. I'm joined by my friend Eric Peters from EPAutos.com. Eric, how are you today?
Well, I'm good, and I'm not going to bleat like a sheep, but I will make an observation, which I think might be interesting to people listening. Now, this is personal and anecdotal, but nonetheless, 2 years into this thing, your humble wrong thinker who's not once worn a mask or practiced any form of sickness kabuki, and in addition to that, am unholy unvaxxed. Somehow I'm not sick, but the 3 times jabbed Secretary of Defense who wears multiple diapers apparently has gotten sick with the Rona.
Dang. There's a lesson in there somewhere, though I'm not sure what it could be.
You think? You think? It had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the sunlight that these, and I always use the air fingers quotes, vaccines don't provide immunity. Remember when they were telling us exactly the opposite, that they're 95% effective, you take this shot, you don't have to worry about the Rona? Well, now it's become impossible to hide the fact that lots of people who've taken not just 1, not just 2, but even 3 jabs are continuing to get sick and to spread the horrible Rona. So where do we go from here?
One thing that I am feeling great certainty about as we come into 2022 is that the narrative, especially the narrative about how you must be jabbed in order to protect yourself, it is falling apart quickly. And one of the biggest developments in recent memory was Dr. Robert Malone, who was one of the pioneering creators of mRNA technology and medical understanding. He was deplatformed by Twitter, then went on Joe Rogan's show, and holy cow, I don't know if you've seen that interview, Eric, but...
for 3 hours, he very meticulously, very rationally, and very calmly explained what mRNA vaccines do and the problems with them. And this is, as you say, from the guy who invented them. So he's got standing to talk. He's not just some radio guy like you or me. He is, you want to put it in terms of familiarity, the science, right? And somehow we're not supposed to listen to this guy, but we are supposed to listen to the doctor who doesn't practice medicine, who's working for the Biden thing.
Isn't that something? And the things that he's pointing out, these are things that we've heard people talk about. It's not like, this just came out of nowhere, but it's being talked about by someone who actually has deep, deep knowledge in that particular field. And Joe Rogan does a marvelous job of letting him talk.
He lets him talk. That's the key, I think, to doing a good interview when you're dealing with somebody who's an expert in whatever their field happens to be, following it up with relevant questions. And Joe's got a real talent for that, and I applaud him for it. And he's really gotten traction because he is doing what the media once did long ago when it was the job of the press to provide information to people so that people could do things like practice informed consent. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah.
In other words, be given the alternatives and told by doctors and experts, look, this drug is available and it does these good things, but it's possible it might also do these bad things, and you should weigh whether you're going to take it or not depending on those things and how they affect you particularly. That's a reasonable, rational approach to medicine. But what's happened is that every kind of information that in any way detracts from the narrative about these vaccines is completely suppressed, and the people who provide that information are banished, and treated as some kind of awful person who, because they're trying to let people know what's going on so that they can make an intelligent decision as opposed to being hard sold on something that may not be in their best interests.
It's fascinating to me just because I've been a part of mainstream media for quite some time, and then I've been a part of not so mainstream media for a long, long time as well. But the mainstream media is losing this battle to keep the narrative on track, and I couldn't be more happy.
Yeah, me either. And I think they became so militantly, obviously over-the-top propagandists to the point where you have to be almost a willful imbecile not to see it at this point. It's no longer shades of gray, and I can kind of see that Dan Rather was a liberal. Now they are just outright shills. And information has come out about things like, for example, as RFK Jr. has pointed out, that Reuters, one of the major news providers, is essentially financed by Pfizer and the pharmaceutical cartels. And how do you trust the information that is bought and paid for by the entity that has a very strong incentive to make sure that the spin is in a certain direction?
Well, I'm grateful, and I think that Joe Rogan's doing a lot of the heavy lifting here, but I also think that there are voices like yours, and I would hope that mine is contributing to this as well. There are a lot of people trying to speak the truth and to shine light into those corners of darkness. Joe Rogan right now is holding the biggest torch that anybody has seen in a while, and it appears to be working. People are waking up.
They are, and again, it's ironic that Rogan is basically a comedian. He doesn't deny that that's what his shtick is. But he's also an excellent interviewer, and he's bringing to light these facts that absolutely nobody else will in the mainstream corporate press, and that resonates. I think there are millions of people in this country who just want a fair shake, who don't want to be lectured, who just want to want to get the information and evaluate it and make a decision for themselves, and not be constantly lectured and told what to do by the likes of Brian Stelter and all these other people.
Yeah, and I think you touched on the reason Rogan is succeeding beyond, the wildest imagination of members of the mainstream media is all he does is facilitate honest, open discussion. What a concept.
Yep, and you notice he doesn't berate the people that he interviews. He has a calm and reasonable discussion with them, and that's how it ought to be. You and I, being old enough to remember the way things used to be when they would have these programs, you would watch a moderator who would have some guests, and the guests might have different opinions, and these opinions might be very wildly diverging, but they had a civil conversation, and they bandied about the facts and the pros and the cons, and it was edifying, and it helped you to understand the world and to deal with it appropriately. Whereas now you're getting Pravda. I mean, blatant just propaganda crammed down your throat in the most belligerent and obnoxious manner imaginable.
Well, and it makes me simultaneously feel encouraged and maybe even a little exhilarated. It also makes me a little bit cautious, just because I understand the people in power are going to see this as a threat. And I'm not trying to be dramatic when I suggest this, but if suddenly someone turns up, hey, we found child porn on Joe Rogan's computer,
sure,
you'll know that he was making the kind of impact that someone in power just could not abide.
I worry about that sort of thing, too, but even if that kind of thing happened to Rogan, somebody else would come forward and take his place. I think we are now at a crucible or fulcrum point where things are tipping in an opposite direction and they're losing control of it. Just to be another old fogey and make another old fogey reference. Do you remember Nicolae Ceausescu?
Oh, yes.
The ex-dictator of Romania. And there's this wonderful video that's still up on YouTube before they pulled it down of the moment when he lost control of the narrative. He was giving a speech to a crowd of people, and you could see there was a moment when everything turned, and the tsunami just washed over him and his regime. Finally, they'd had enough of it. They'd been under this guy's thumb for decades, and finally they'd had enough of it. And I think after 2 years, I think a lot of Americans have simply had enough of this, too.
Yeah, and it was not a happy ending for him or for his wife. I mean, they were given a trial. They were dragged out and shot on Christmas Day because of the things that they had done to the people. Now, I'm certainly not advocating that, but I do want to see accountability for the people who have caused harm. And if that means they have to sit in court and answer for what they've done, well, then that should happen.
Amen. Absolutely. It's not only should, it's necessary. What's going on is no longer a question of good intentions that went awry, of mistakes that were made. We are now at the point where we can say, in all fairness and with accuracy, that what's happened has become a deliberate, malicious effort to tyrannize the population, to terrorize the population, to use the pretext of public health to enslave the population, to despoil people's lives, to hurt children. Think about all the millions of kids who have been psychologically traumatized by what's happened over the last 2 years. It is obscene, and people who are responsible must be held to account for it.
Well, and again, for those who may have joined us a little bit late, Eric has just been telling us, early on in the interview, you have gone unmasked, you have gone unjabbed, and after 2 years of all this fear that's swirling around you, you remain unscathed. I'm knocking on wood as I say that, by the way, but
sure.
There's something
most
to learn
people are
from
unscathed. This is one of the things that should have been brought out in public and talked about by the responsible authorities. And what I refer to here is the fact that the original Rona, not the latest variant of it, but the original Rona, most people who got it who did not have comorbidities, in other words, who weren't already pretty sick or very old, stood a 99.8% chance of not dying. Now, that is a very calming statistic, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
And that should have been presented to the populace to calm people down and say, look, yeah, this is potentially serious if you fall into one of these categories, and yes, it's reasonable that precautions should be taken if you fall into one of those categories and around people like that. But it's not as bad as we thought, and that's good.
Well, I appreciate your take on this. We're going to take a real quick commercial break. Eric Peters from EPAutos.com is my guest. There is a link to his website in the show notes, which you'll find at thebryanhydeshow.com.
This is The Bryan Hyde Show. This is The Bryan Hyde Show.
Welcome back to the show. Eric Peters from EPAutos.com is my guest. Eric, as you may know, is one of the great voices of reason out there on matters regarding freedom. But, Eric, you're also my go-to guy when it comes to things automotive. And I've seen a couple of articles on your site recently that really grabbed my attention. The first one was the sad news that apparently muscle cars are on their way out. Did I see this correctly? Dodge is going to stop making our favorite muscle cars?
Yeah, well, they're being forced to stop making them by our wonderful government again, because the V8 Hemi that powers cars like the Challenger and the Charger, and also Ram trucks and a number of Jeep models like the Grand Cherokee, simply can no longer meet the regulatory hurdles that have been imposed by the Biden thing, including the latest one, which mandates that all new cars will average 50-something miles per gallon by model year 2026. So Stellantis, which is the parent company of Dodge, Chrysler, Jeep, and Ram, announced that they will be retiring the Hemi, even though they'll be continuing, apparently, to make some iteration of the Charger and the Challenger. The problem is you take away the V8, and you're left with something that's no longer what it was. The whole point of those cars was that they had these big, hairy V8 engines. People don't want a hybrid, a six-cylinder, or, God help us, a turbocharged four-cylinder hybrid, but that's where things are headed.
Wow. Now, you followed this up with an article about the rationing of speed, and I thought that could be a fun thing to explore. Some people have been conditioned and trained, from a very early age. Now, speed is bad, slower is better, but talk to me about the practicality of not just speed, but all the other things that we're missing out on.
Well, it's not just speed. What I hit on is, or leapfrog from, is you constantly hear about how electric cars, and particularly Teslas, have ludicrous speed, and they'll talk about how they get from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds or such, which is very true. The problem is that the electric cars that most people can afford do not have ludicrous speed and do not get to 60 in 3 seconds. In fact, they're pretty slow if you look at the numbers. A Nissan Leaf takes about 7.5 seconds to get to 60, which is about average for a four-cylinder crossover non-electric car, and nothing at all special. And the point that I'm making here is that right now you can get all sorts of powerful and fun cars at a price that ordinary people can afford. You can pick up a Challenger, for example, that we were just talking about, for about $35,000, or a Mustang GT for about the same. Or for a lot less, you could pick up something like a Mazda Miata or a Subaru WRX. And for that amount of money, all you can get is an entry-level electric car that not only isn't particularly speedy, it suffers from the gimp of not being able to go very far and all the other problems associated with electric cars. Now, if you want speed, then you got to kick up to something like a Tesla 3, and now you're looking at $50,000 for speed. And what that means is that most people are no longer going to be able to afford a fun, fast car, and we're kind of headed toward this bleak Sovietization of transportation, where only the elite, people who are connected with the government and have the money to do it, are able to indulge themselves in things that are fun and powerful.
Yeah, I know there are people who will say, in the name of safety, we had to do this, or in the name of saving the globe, or saving the environment, we had to do this. I got to ask you, though, are there practical reasons to have, horsepower and to have other features that can't make the cut in order to make those mileage guidelines?
Well, of course, sure. Speed comes in really handy when you pull out from, say, the supermarket shopping lot and you see somebody bearing down on you at high speed, and the only thing you can do is get out of their way. And if your car is slow, you're not going to have that option. And power also gives you the ability to do things like pull a trailer, or if you're a guy who likes to do a lot of home improvement projects, to go down to Lowe's and get a pallet of bricks or a sheet of OSB, a couple of sheets of OSB, and drag them home.
Right.
These are things that electric cars cannot do. They don't have the capability and capacity to do them.
Well, and again, it just illustrates that ongoing problem of government expansion into every possible area of our lives.
Exactly. Now, in the past, there were high-performance vehicles that only the rich could afford, but the big difference was there was no bar to companies and individuals who looked at that and thought, I could probably make something that would do the same thing for less money. A really good example from the world of motorcycles, for example, is back in the 50s, the fastest production bike was a bike called the Vincent Black Shadow, which is a great name, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
But it was a very expensive bike, and only a few people could afford to get it. Well, Soichiro Honda, who was the founder of Honda, decided he could do something like that for a lot less, and he came up with the CB750 in 1969. And that was a bike that almost anybody, literally a high school kid, could afford. And all of a sudden, average people had access to the kind of speed and performance that previously only very affluent people could get. And we've lost that. And that's a tragedy. And it's not just in transportation, it's everywhere. They're going to ration and minimize and decrease the things that Americans once took for granted, things like single-family homes, things like multiple cars, all of the amenities and stuff that kind of democratized life and made the distinction between very rich people and working-class people not as much as they have been historically.
Eric, as part of your work in test driving and writing reviews on numerous types of cars, does this throw a bit of a wet blanket over what you do? Does it limit?
Without question.
Does it limit what you get to experience?
Well, not what I get to experience, but what I have to write about. Certainly, we are on the cusp. We're moving toward this era when essentially cars will be what I call universal transportation appliances. Essentially, you'll have the choice of small, medium, or larger in your choice of color, but they're all fundamentally the same, electrically powered, with nothing to get particularly excited about and nothing for me to write about other than, well, this one's got a bigger touchscreen than that one has.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate what you're doing. Now, I have to ask, is there anything you have driven within the last few weeks that really stands out in your mind that you'd recommend people maybe get some hands-on experience with?
Well, yeah, I just finished and actually still have the new Ford Explorer, which is kind of interesting because the Explorer was one of the first SUVs when it came out so many decades ago, and then Ford changed it around to a crossover, which is essentially a car-based vehicle that looks like an SUV but really isn't as capable as an SUV. And then they rechanged it again to what it is now, which is back to being an SUV. I mean, it's based on a rear-wheel drive layout, has real four-wheel drive available, not all-wheel drive, and it has capability and it has strength that most crossovers in that class, in that size range with standard 3 rows of seats, do not have. So it really stands out. If you're looking for a vehicle for your family that can pull a boat, it has a standard 5,200-pound tow rating.
Wow.
That can go off-road and do things that most of the crossovers can't. It's definitely worth a look.
Interesting. Wow. Well, it just so happens the wife and I are, we're in the market looking to replace one of our cars, and it's got to be something that can tow. But we don't need to tow a fifth wheel. But that it's good to know that there's still some options out there. I don't feel encouraged at very much that I see out there, although I do like getting to live vicariously through some of the articles that you write about the various cars that you drive.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm hoping to get my hands on. They're going to put apparently the Hellcat drivetrain for a last hurrah in other Jeep products before the plug gets pulled, and hopefully I'm going to get a chance to drive some of those soon.
Ooh, well, that could add up to some fun. Now,
I mean, what could be better than a 4x4 that runs an 11-second quarter mile?
Right? Yeah. I just wanted to make sure they got a defibrillator waiting for me at the end of the track in case my heart skips a beat and stops.
Yep.
Eric, we got about a minute left here.
Okay.
Let's take a moment to talk about your website. I want to introduce my listeners to it. For people who have never been there, first of all, where will they find it? What can they expect to find?
Well, I'm pretty easy. It's just epautos.com, and they'll find practically everything, primarily about cars, but not just cars, about topics that touch on transportation, liberty, and also just fun articles. I posted a retrospective the other day about some motorcycles that I own. That's a side passion of mine, and a lot of people are interested in that. But practically anything there except online casino gambling.
and he's got some great sponsors, as well as he's got some tremendous commenters who follow along and leave some very thought-provoking content there in the comment sections.
Absolutely, yeah. And I hope people who are listening to the show will consider joining that conversation, because it's a lot of fun and there's also a lot to be learned.
Yep. Hey, it's all about, again, that free and open flow of discussion and conversation. Joe Rogan does it. Eric Peters does it. By gosh, the more people do it, I think the better we're going to be. Eric, great visiting with you.
Amen, my fellow wrong thinker.
All right, we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Bryan.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. Hey, just a quick mention of some of the sponsors who make this program possible on a daily basis. If you're getting something from this, okay, other than, agitated, higher blood pressure, ulcers, and the like. No, if you're getting a clearer view of the world, but more importantly, a sense of peace and calm that God is still in charge, and that, yes, you have a role to play that is essential, then I would encourage you, please, reach out to the sponsors who make this program possible, including MonticelloCollege.org, LifesavingFood.com, the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage, HSLAmmo.com, SewingQuiltingCenter.com, and GovernYourIncome.com. So, as I mentioned in my conversation with Eric Peters, this headline, Indiana life insurance CEO says deaths are up 40% among people ages 18 to 64. Now, I try very hard not to be a sensationalist, and look, Alex Jones has probably done some good, but I also think he has shot himself in the foot just because of the sensational manner in which so much of his information has been presented. People who might have listened if it were presented more rationally, they hear the ranting and raving. When you get to the point where you're spittle flinging, you got a problem. It's important, and I understand why people may want to fly off the handle, but that doesn't necessarily translate into, now people have to listen because I'm all riled up. But I see a headline like this. Deaths are up 40% among people ages 18 to 64. I've got a link to the article here that talks about this. This is from Steve Kirsch's newsletter. I picked this up off of LouRockwell.com today. He says, look, this is huge. Something is killing healthy people at an unprecedented rate, and it isn't COVID. Now, he speculates as to maybe it could be the COVID vaccine. He says he thinks so and offers the reasons why he believes that could be the case. But the bottom line is, we've been fed a lot of misinformation. I think we're at a very interesting place right now, where the narrative of, look, we had to do all these horrible things. We had to shut down society. We had to force people to do this, force people to do that, mandate this, mandate that. That narrative is falling apart. Things have flipped. And, not everybody agrees with that. There are some people, for some reason, I don't understand this part of human nature, but there are some people who actually thrive on being afraid. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Count of Monte Cristo. This is about a guy who is terribly wronged, betrayed in the worst possible ways, imprisoned falsely. Finally, he makes his escape. He finds a tremendous treasure, and then he sets about getting revenge on the people who ruined his life and stole from him the happiness that he once had. And in particular, there's a woman that he loves, that he's looking to put the boots to her as well for the role that he believes she played. And at some point, she confronts him about this. When she realizes who she is, she's like, why are you doing this? And he pleads with her, don't rob me of my hate. It's a very powerful moment in the film. And it's also very descriptive of that strange quirk of human nature where there are people who are like, don't rob me of my fear. I can show you what I think could be pretty convincing evidence. Ultimately, you get to make that choice, but I could show you pretty convincing evidence that the things that we've been told, the things that have been pronounced as unassailable fact, in fact, unquestionable fact, to the point that we have active censorship taking place. You can't think those things. We're going to remove them from social media. We're going to deplatform you. We're going to do everything we can to smear you. And it's the media, it's the political class, and to a large extent, segments of corporate America have bought into this and have forced it through. They've done the dirty deeds for their cohorts in government. But what they were telling us was not based in reality. And it's something that they couldn't have kept hidden forever. The truth eventually would come out. I believe it's starting to come out. And it gives me two kind of weird opposite reactions. On the one hand, it's very exhilarating to see their narrative crumble. It actually makes me feel like, maybe I wasn't such an oddball for the approach that I've taken over this last couple of years. But I'm also filled with a sense of I don't know if dread is the right word, but I'm filled with a sense of anxiousness, because if they are cornered, the people, the institutions that have participated in this massive lie, this massive fraud that has been pushed on not just the American people, but people all over the world, what are they likely to do? I mean, the evidence to me seems pretty clear that we're talking about the kind of people who would have no qualms about getting violent or instigating more violence than we've already seen. Remember, some forms of violence are actually acceptable. Why, it's just mostly peaceful protests, It's really, there's nothing to be seen here. Unless, of course, grandma's walking around inside the U.S. Capitol with an American flag, having been waved through the door by the police officer after, a bunch of people pushed their way in. Oh, that's an insurrection. That's, the kind of thing we ought to have the military rounding up everybody. They've held people for nearly a year based on the suspicion these people have engaged in insurrection. Nobody has been charged with insurrection. So I think the stakes are very high, which means that the people who are trying desperately to hold on to power, to continue to toe the line on that narrative, they may be capable of doing some really crazy stuff, if to save their own skins or just to try to maintain that illusion that, no, we're still in control. So I don't recommend, immerse yourself even deeper and get even more, neck deep in all the information about this. You definitely want to be aware. But I also think it's good to step back every so often and remind yourself what they are doing and what they are trying to do doesn't have to involve you. You can opt out of their narrative, for instance. You can opt out of the fear. You can go back to living as normal a life as you can. Yeah, there are some things that are a little bit tougher. Well, what if I want to fly across the country, fly across the ocean and go see a family member? Yeah, that's going to be pretty tough. Because they're still talking about, well, you've got to have, proof of vaccination. You've got to have, these papers in order to travel. We're at a very interesting time right now. And I feel as though we are building to a tipping point, and I don't know which way it's going to go. I would like to think that the tipping point is going to lead us back into a place where common sense, where accountability for those in power, and where personal freedom can once again be part of what is considered normal. But there's a crazy amount of people that don't want that still want to cling to the idea that, no, there must be some mistake or something. But you look at that headline. Indiana Life Insurance CEO says deaths are up 40% among people ages 18 to 64. I've got the link to Steve Kirsch's newsletter. I encourage you, take a look at this for yourself. Deaths among 18 to 64-year-olds who don't normally die are up 40% in 2021 versus pre-pandemic levels. It's not COVID. COVID deaths are actually down this year. Something has caused a very big change. I don't know what that is, and I'm not going to immediately jump to the conclusion, it's the vaccine. I don't know that it is. But whatever it is that's causing this is something bigger and more deadly than COVID, and it's affecting nearly everyone. And the CDC, of course, is right on top of this. Well, Steve Kerr says, I'm kidding. The CDC's as clueless as usual. Now, he tries to put together a few of the clues here. One of them being, these deaths started only after the vaccines rolled out. And the deaths are primarily working-age people, 18 to 64, who are employees of companies that have group life insurance plans through One America. That's not to say that 65 and older aren't affected as well, but he says what's key is that we're seeing these effects in young people. There are more excess deaths than any time in history. So it's likely caused by a new threat, never before seen in history, like perhaps a novel vaccine that's never been used before, or something new like that a huge number of people would be exposed to, such as by a state that pushes vaccination. Now, I don't think this is just wild speculation on the part of Steve Kirsch. In fact, when we come back, Dr. Robert Malone, one of the people who pioneered mRNA, vaccine technology, he has some thoughts on this as well. And he actually goes so far as to suggest perhaps the biggest mass medical experiment in history is at the root of this unprecedented number of deaths of people between 18 and 64. Again, my goal isn't to scare you, but if we're going to be aware, we should be aware of this.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Want to send some love out to Sewing and Quilting Center in St. George, Utah. I don't know if you knew this, but they have a huge handy quilter event this month. So if you know someone who is really into quilting and wants to do it right, you should probably turn them on to sewingandquiltingcenter.com. This is the place to go. Now, Eric Alsop said, look, you need to let your listeners know all machines are on season-end pricing, including some of the hard-to-find machines available for in-store purchase. This includes machines from Brother, Baby Lock, and Genome. And, of course, every machine comes with free classes on how to use it. They never expire. All the machine classes can be taken again if you happen to forget or you just want a refresher course. How cool is that? I mean, it's a pretty significant investment, but it's one that you're not just, you're on your own. Good luck figuring it out. Now, they have got some great teachers. Tammy and Vernie are their teachers, the best people in southern Utah for learning how to use your machine. So maybe you should check with them. And, of course, they are doing free pickup and delivery during January on sewing and long arms that need service. So if you have a quilting machine or a sewing machine that needs to be fixed, talk to sewingandquiltingcenter.com. There's a link in the show notes. It'll take you right to them, including their phone number. All right, let's get to this. If there was ever a headline to get your attention, it's the one that says Indiana Life Insurance CEO says deaths are up 40% among people ages 18 to 64. Dr. Robert Malone, who I think single-handedly, with the help of Joe Rogan's massive listening audience, has put a stake into the heart of the narrative that, everything that's being done to mitigate to COVID and the pandemic is correct and necessary. He asks the question, what if the largest experiment on human beings in history is a failure? Dr. Malone says, a seasoned stock analyst texted me a link today, and when I clicked it open, I could hardly believe what I was reading. What a headline. That's the one I've been sharing with you. He says this headline is a nuclear truth bomb masquerading as an insurance agent's dry manila envelope full of actuarial tables. Now, Dr. Malone says people frequently write to Jill and myself, people we've never met. They call, they arrive at the farm by appointment or unannounced. They fill our email inboxes with their inquiries. They all want something, time, attention, an interview. Many may want to tell us about their fear, illness, nightmares, or what seems like outright paranoid conspiracies. And then over time, he says these fears and conspiracies keep getting confirmed. As Jan Jekielek, a senior editor with the Epoch Times, recently said to him, it's getting harder and harder to tell which ones are mere conspiracy theories and which ones are true reality. Dr. Malone says one farm visitor told me of his foreshadowing massive numbers of deaths within 3 years consequent to the genetic vaccines, and that this was all about the Great Reset and the depopulation agenda of the World Economic Forum. Dr. Malone says I tried to reassure him that, in my opinion, this was highly unlikely, while privately thinking about how easily people fall into this type of conspiracy ideation, and how I need to be careful to avoid going there when confronting so many public health decisions that appear either incompetent or nefarious. Now, he says, at the time, I only knew of the World Economic Forum as the host of a big annual party in Davos, Switzerland, where the uber-rich and the hoi oligoi of the Western nations went to watch TED Talks and drink the best wine and be seen. Silly me. What a long, strange trip this has been. He says, I doubt that even Hunter S. Thompson could have imagined it in his most drug and booze-addled state. But he says, suffice to say, I nominate Ralph Steadman as the official illustrator of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, or a resurrected Hieronymus Bosch. But he says, I'm wandering from a point that I'm afraid to clearly state. It is starting to look to me like the largest experiment on human beings in recorded history has failed. And if this rather dry report from a senior Indiana life insurance executive holds true, then Rainer Fuhlmich's Crimes Against Humanity push for convening new Nuremberg trials starts to look a lot less chaotic and a lot more prophetic. Now, Dr. Malone says, here's what lit me up in this report from the Center Square contributor, Margaret Menge. Quote, the head of Indianapolis-based insurance company, One America, said the death rate is up a stunning 40% from pre-pandemic levels among working-age people. We are seeing right now the highest death rates we've seen in the history of this business, not just at One America. That's the company's CEO, Scott Davison, saying this during an online news conference this week. He says the data is consistent across every player in that business. One America is a $100 billion insurance company that has had its headquarters in Indianapolis since 1877. The company has approximately 2,400 employees and sells life insurance, including group life insurance, to employers in the state. Davison says the increase in deaths represents huge numbers, and that it's not elderly people who are dying, but primarily working-age people, 18 to 64, who are employees of companies that have group life insurance plans through One America. He said, and what we saw in just the third quarter, we're seeing it continue into fourth quarter, is that death rates are up over 40% over what they were pre-pandemic. Just to give you an idea how bad that is, a 3 sigma or 1 in 200 year catastrophe would be a 10% increase over pre-pandemic. So 40% is just unheard of. Dr. Malone asks, what's driving this unprecedented surge in all-cause mortality? Most of the claims being filed for deaths are not classified as COVID-19 deaths. Davison said, what the data is showing to us is that the deaths that are being reported as COVID deaths greatly understate the actual death losses among working-age people from the pandemic. It may not all be COVID on their death certificate, but the deaths are up huge numbers. So Dr. Malone says, look, let's continue on assuming that you've read the article. And it's linked in there, so you really have no excuse for not reading it for yourself. He says, at a minimum, based on my reading, one has to conclude that if this report holds and is confirmed by others in the dry world of insurance actuaries, we have both a huge human tragedy and a profound public policy failure of the U.S. government and the U.S. Health and Human Services system to serve and protect the citizens that pay for this service. If this holds true, he says, then the genetic vaccines so aggressively promoted have failed. And the clear federal campaign to prevent early treatment with life-saving drugs has contributed to a massive avoidable loss of life. At worst, he says this report implies that the federal workplace vaccine mandates have driven what appear to be a true crime against humanity. Massive loss of life in presumably workers that have been forced to accept a toxic vaccine at higher frequency relative to the general population of Indiana. Furthermore, he says, we've also been living through the most massive, globally coordinated propaganda and censorship campaign in the history of the human race. All major mass media and social media technology companies have coordinated to stifle and suppress any discussion of the risks of the genetic vaccines and or alternative early treatments. He's not wrong. And he says if this report holds true, there must be accountability. We're not just talking about running over the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States and grinding it into the mud with an army of artificial intelligence-powered heavy infantry. This article reads like a dry description of an avoidable mass casualty event caused by a mandated experimental medical procedure, one for which all opportunities for the victims to have become self-informed about the potential risks have been methodically erased from both the internet and from public awareness by an international corrupt cabal operating under the flag of the Trusted News Initiative. He says George Orwell must be spinning in his grave. And he concludes by saying, I hope I'm wrong. I fear that I am right. Now, you know, of course, that my goal on this program is not to instill fear or anger. But that's some pretty sobering stuff to consider. Okay, it shakes me. And I feel like my backbone has strengthened considerably over the years, just based on some of the things that I have recognized. Well, that's a reality. This is what's happening. I don't know, and so I want to make very clear, I'm not saying the vaccines are responsible for this unusual uptick in deaths of people between 18 and 64 years of age that are not COVID. But it's so clear that the people in power and their enablers in the media, and unfortunately many of their cohorts within corporate America, have been pushing something on us that has not delivered on its promises to protect people from catching the virus or to prevent illness or death. What if? That's the big question that should be looming large over everyone, and I can't answer it for you, but what if it was a huge failed experiment? Where do we go from here? And should there be accountability? I say yes.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.